dedicated to the launch of the edited volume of just about to come book, in which the title is Law in the EU Circular Energy Systems, Biofuel, Biowaste, and Biogas. So the book has many contributors, as we're going to see in the introduction, several contributors, many lawyers, political sciences, economists in an interdisciplinary approach. And it has exactly to unveil this combination about how rules and how policies has been designed to drive a more circular energy system. So you were getting there when speaking about the concept of circular energy systems, but let's now speaking about who is going to be here today in the FSI Insights. So we have today the great pleasure of host with 3 speakers. So my first speaker, let me introduce my great colleague, Professor Josephine van Zeben, who is a chair of the law group in the Zeben University and Research. And together with me, we co-edited this book. We have this pleasure of co-edited this book. And together with me and Josephine, we invited 2 of our colleagues who contributed and collaborated with chapters of the book. And our first colleague is going to speak today. It's Elisa Cavalli. She's now a postdoc at Ghana University. Elisa wrote a chapter in which the title was Forest, Waste, and Biofuel and Biogas, Law and Policy. And next to Elisa Cavalli, I would have my colleague Lynn Barton, who is now a PhD candidate at the University of Strathfield and Research. And she was one of the co-authors, together with Mita Alessandrini and Edwin Ablas, writing a chapter on agricultural waste to biofuel and biogas, law and policy. And as you can see, for the audiences of the energy of the FSR Francisco regulation, you can see some that by choosing the speakers, we had tried to replicate the exercise we did in the book, which was to put it together scholars who are familiar with the regulation of waste, biowaste, especially in sectors of forest, agriculture, and food, with the energy scholars, and see to what extent we have a regulations that with coherent delivery the policies outputs. Together with the speakers, we have 2 discussants, 2 colleagues of Florence School of Regulation, typically, or FSI Insights. When we have like external speakers, we have discussants or FSR colleagues. And today I have the pleasure of having Sophia Nicolai, who is our research associate at FSR, and Ginevra Lemoli, who is now at the moment visiting scholar at Robert Schumann, but soon is going to join us as Florence School of Regulation as forthcoming assistant professor, which we're super happy to have actually selected her to our team. So let me start it now. After introduce the event, let me give you some idea about the book, and let now remove my cap of host, and actually allow me to give to the cap of speaker. And so I also will share with you the slides. I will share with you all the slides. So my colleagues who's coming after me is going to tell me when they want me to move the slides. But let's give this first 15 minutes dedicated to explain the book, a little bit about the book. So you can find it, the cover of the book, the title, the editors, and all the contributors, which we're very glad for the work they have done, of course. So I think for the audience who are speaking, actually most of them that is very familiar with energy regulation, I think the concept of circular energy system, to understand the book first of all, we needed to have a conceptual clarification, because the concept of the book used the term circular energy system. So it might sometimes create confusion, and you have noticed while discussing the book, creates a confusion between 2 concepts. The first one is energy system integration. The second one is circular energy system. So energy system integration is a concept that comes with the European Commission when they come with specific on WE strategy for energy system integration. And this concept is much related about the coordination plan and operations of energy systems as a whole across multiple energy carriers, infrastructures, and consumption sectors, and is the pathway towards an effective, affordable, and deep decarbonization. So it basically changed the paradigm of having energy systems as linear, but actually trying to connect it to have circularity in all its sectors, or its integration in all its vectors. Actually, when you speak about circular energy system in the book, you are more related to the classical concept of circular economy, which I'm not in this introduction get deep on this concept. But actually what we're trying to look at is to what extent the regulation is putting in place and enabling the development of a circular energy system, which is rely on the use of the waste and residues from three sectors: agriculture, food, and forest sectors, and support this capacity building for rural circular energy communities, to the development of energy biofuels and biogas, including here biomethane. So the concept of circular energy systems more linked with a circular economy in itself, the use of biowaste, biomass, or more specifically not any type of biomass, biowaste, to the production of biofuel and bioenergy, more specifically biofuel and biogas. So it's a very niche. And this idea came out actually from, we started this book project in 2021, right it close when you have the Fit for 55 package, in which you have like a policy documents signalizing the support of renewable, the push to renewable energy directives to more renewable energy, not only in gas sector through biomethane, but also the full, especially when it comes to marine and aviation initiatives. And then you have many of policy documents that come out since 2021, the framework of the decarbonization of gas market that signalize the importance of the green gases, including these green gases, not only the non-biological ones, the FNBOs, but as well, like together, biogas coming from biomethane that can be injected in pipelines. This idea was hanged forth in 2022 by REPowerEU, when there was a clear statement in which to catch the decarbonization with the more ambitious decarbonization strategies. These targets become more explicitly, including the production of bioenergy coming from biowaste, the importance of it. And you can see this replicating between Head 3, the proposal of the Commission, provisional agreements, and the Council that actually was released just 2 days ago. So with this idea in mind, what we had it in 2020, 2021, when we proposed the book, was to try exactly to bring together two types of scholars that hardly speaks the same language, or usually it's hardly they sit in the same place, which are the ones that comes from waste regulation, and request them, which they did a wonderful job on doing this, to reflect deeply in thinking, okay, what are the regulations of forest, food, waste, and agricultural waste, to what extent you would have drivers that would that would channel the biowaste of these sectors to the production of energy or not, especially when you're speaking about biofuel and biogas. The energy sectors, bioenergy sectors experts looking at the drivers on the demand side and the economic instruments for it operates. And the conclusions of the book, I will leave it to my colleague Josephine to give you a few words, but now I speak already a lot, and I'm pleasure to give the words to Elisa, who is going to explain her chapter. So the floor is yours, Elisa.
So hello, everyone. And as Lucila mentioned, I will talk about forestry waste. So next slide, please. So this is a small intro of to give an idea of what we have going on in the EU when it comes to EU forests and forestry waste. So we have a forest area that covers about 44% of the EU land area, and generally, while the area has been generally stable over the past years, it has been subject to pressures, and we are concerned over the long-term health and stability of these areas. Forestry is a very important part of the activities that take place in the EU, and they have, of course, a relevance for bioenergy. And we see that bioenergy is a big part of the renewable energy, and that a lot of the wood that we use in the EU is exploited for energy production, and a lot of it is primary wood. So basically wood that is purposefully harvested for basically raw materials. And when we think about increasing the biomass pool, that's not always the best option, because afforestation, reforestation, and conversion to plantations may not be suitable or desirable depending on the situation when we have going on on the ground. When it comes to forestry waste, it's also important to note that some biomass from harvesting operation needs to stay on site for ecological reasons. And we have different types of residues that perform different ecological roles, and the removal then has different impacts. Generally, we can say that circular use of wood and wood products and the prioritization of the use of waste within certain parameters, because you have to be mindful of displacement effects, are key elements for sustainability, and this requires intelligent pathways. And this is basically the base of my chapter. I'm not going to talk about this, but there are many new and older policy and legislative instruments relevant for forests. But as I mentioned, if you're curious, you can read the chapter, or we can discuss it in the Q&A. Next slide, please. So the starting point in terms of principle and approaches is well represented by the waste hierarchy and the cascading use of biomass, and both of them are basically principles and approaches that place a priority order in the waste management and for the waste hierarchy and in the use of the biomass. And all involve, basically prioritizing certain actions before others. Next slide, please. So, and these are the starting questions that I have as, well, the starting points of my research are the waste hierarchy and the cascading principle operational when it comes to the use of forestry materials for energy production, and if so, to what extent? Is there a regulatory distinction between forestry waste and materials and raw materials? And is forestry waste valorized? And if so, how? And the third question is, what is the role of private schemes and standards for the use of forestry materials for energy production? The next slide, please. So I analyzed two frameworks. One is the Waste Framework Directive, and the second one is the Renewable Energy Directive, and they are interconnected in that also the Renewable Energy Directive also refers to the definition of waste in the Waste Framework Directive. But what I want to focus on in terms of the Waste Framework Directive is the fact that the forestry residues and waste are excluded from the application of the Waste Framework Directive in certain cases. So starting from the point that we have, of course, the scope of the Waste Framework Directive that is basically concerning waste materials, and then we have the definition of waste that you see in Article 3.1. You would think that forestry waste is a waste and so falls under the scope of the Waste Framework Directive, but this is not entirely the case. And you can see the exclusion in Article 2.1f. That might have basically consequences in terms of the application of the waste hierarchy and on the cascading use of the biomass principle. And this is basically what I argue in my chapter. Next slide, please. When it comes to the Renewable Energy Directive, we have the definition of biomass and forest biomass, and I checked whether within these definitions we have already some distinction between waste and products or raw materials, and I found that there is none. They're very inclusive and they're all encompassing basically. So we need to look at the criteria to see whether we have a distinction between waste and raw materials. So we find that the definitions are indeed attached to the criteria, and the criteria that we have that concern forest materials are the sustainability and the LULUCF criteria and the GHG emission saving criteria. Can you also already press, because I think there's something missing in the slide. I think and another one. Okay, perfect. And the criteria are instrumental for the renewable targets and for eligibility for support. So they're not unimportant. They're actually one of the key aspects of bioenergy in the Renewable Energy Directive. And I argue that the criteria are not strong enough and do not particularly incentivize the use of forestry waste materials over raw materials, and that the cascading principle and the waste hierarchy in general in the Renewable Energy Directive are not really considered to the extent that I would like to see. So we do have a distinction between a valorization of the waste materials, and this happens through the regime for advanced biofuels, which are basically fuels from specific feedstocks and in which waste materials play an important role. And we have also materials from forestry. And we have a valorization of waste materials in the sense that we have a double counting mechanism of the energy content. And in this way, we basically, advanced biofuels are worth more from a target perspective. In the proposal for ADE 3, we have some of the concerns that I have in my that I expressed in my chapter. They are addressed, but I would argue that more is needed. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. As for the private schemes, we have. I think that the role of schemes and standards should not be downplayed, and we have that in the context of the RED, Renewable Energy Directive. Schemes can be used to demonstrate compliance with the criteria that I mentioned earlier. We have also a process of assessment of the schemes by the Commission and the recognition of the schemes, and you can see on the right side of the screen the approved voluntary schemes, national certification schemes, and also the ones that are basically the open applications for that. The Commission to increase reliability, transparency, and independent auditing, which are problems that are often associated and have been connected to schemes of various nature, has drafted and adopted an implementing act on rules to verify sustainability, the GHG emission saving criteria and ILUC risk criteria. And what I would also like to mention is that standards and schemes can also be stronger than the RED criteria. So this adds to the discussion in the fact that private schemes may help towards sustainability. They can also be an appealing option for organization, but also for states. So if you are interested, you can read a bit more in my chapter. And I think I'm done from my side.
Thank you so much, Elisa. So then we move it to the next slide, if it works. Okay, perfect. Which is move us to our next speaker, which is Lynn Batten. Lynn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me. That was a fantastic presentation, Eliza. So our chapter that I wrote together with Mirta Alessandrini and Edwin Alblas is really based on on our use of agricultural waste to biofuels and biogas, because a lot of the biofuel production is traditionally crop-based biofuel, so usually for ethanol. And even now, still 60% of renewables used in transport is based on crop-based biofuels, which has been an incredible drive for something called, well, that Eliza also mentioned, indirect land use change, and it really changed the agricultural landscape using arable land that could be used for food for the production of fuel. And in this new energy directive, they're really trying to actively eliminate the consumption of food and feed for food stock for energy by 2030. And so in this paper, we're looking at how the Renewable Energy Directive and the Common Agricultural Policy, what kind of convergences and divergences they're having in relation to the use of agricultural waste and manure for bioenergy production as a feedstock rather than using crop-based biofuels. We're looking at two specific waste streams, which is so agricultural residue, agricultural manure, but also contaminated land. So when looking at this analysis, we are seeing that, for instance, 94.4 million tons of dry mass of residue is being generated in the EU on a yearly basis, including 122 megatons of manure. And then the EU has also estimated that there are 342,000 contaminated land sites that could be used for the production of biofuel instead of prime agricultural lands. And so in order to leverage these waste streams, it's incredibly important to have a legal framework that is unified in capitalizing these waste streams as well and giving active support and subsidies towards this. So going to the Renewable Energy Directive, what we found that they stated about the agricultural waste streams is that the emphasis is really about moving away from the food and feed crops for energy, as I said, but the emphasis on then using those waste streams is really lacking. In order to to be able to use the agricultural waste streams or to use agricultural crops towards the share of renewable energy production, it can be used if it is certified with low indirect land use change risk. And these criteria were also mentioned by Eliza in the forestry part of this. So one of the interesting parts of the criteria is that, for instance, food and feed crop from degraded lands can be used towards renewable energy production share. Also, if it's produced by smallholders, or if it's become more financially attractive to produce biofuels. And also there are some sustainability criteria, for instance, that you can no longer grow biofuel crops on high biodiversity land from agricultural land. And the emphasis is also set on the amount of GHG emissions. Now, there is in the annex a part in which GHG emissions for agricultural residues is measured. And so it does have rules for calculating it, but it doesn't actively support it. Now, what is really interesting about these criteria when it comes to agricultural waste is that you can only use agricultural waste and residue, including manure, if it is monitored by an authorized authority for that it's not detrimental for soil quality and soil carbon. Because in practice, a lot of the dry mass from the agricultural residue is actually cultivated back into the soil to give that fertility back into the soil. So you don't want to mitigate that sort of soil fertility. And now, also looking forward, we don't see any substantial change when it comes to the proposal of the new energy directive, when it comes to any emphasis on the use of waste streams or subsidy for this. Next slide, please. Then the second framework that we were looking at was obviously the Common Agricultural Policy, the main policy that regulates the agricultural sector here, which is now being enforced since January 2023. The agricultural policy traditionally and historically has subsidized the use of biofuel and the growing of biofuel in agriculture. So it's really shaped the way in which biofuel production has grown so large in the EU, because it was actively subsidized in the 1982 McSherry reform and later also in the 2000 reforms as well. In this day, they are moving away from those subsidies. However, they're not actively, again, emphasizing those waste streams. So the Common Agricultural Policy is looking at impact indicators to measure the new CAP objectives, for which we're emphasizing impact indicator 12 about the production of renewable energy. That has been measured with the result indicators of the advancement of the production for bio-based renewable energy, and then result indicator 16, which is looking at specifically the investment support for this. That being said, a lot of the responsibility in terms of national implementation is based for the national strategic plans on the member states, which are very divergent and have very different ways of implementing these measures into their national strategic plans. After a comparative analysis of the national strategic plans, we did find that 18 member states have already included a specific non-productive investment support for the intervention and the promotion of biogas specifically for agricultural waste streams, such as, for instance, Latvia is looking at how to invest and innovate and develop manure management systems for the production of energy and heat. And then Ireland is also mentioning the availability and emphasizing the availability of manure waste streams for as a feedstock for biofuel as well. So even though there are divergences within the national strategic plans, you do see that there's quite a lot of emphasis within that for the use of these waste streams and the valorization of these waste streams as well. So even though it's lacking in real emphasis and support for this, it is fine that the member states are actually do and are supporting this. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I think it was perfect through presentations and chapters. I think one thing that I have not mentioned in the introduction is that the main focus of the book is at EU level, looking at EU regulation, but many of the chapters also did an investigation about the member states. So, like for instance, the National Energy and Climate programs that, and many of them would have included bioenergy as one of the key strategic source. But let me also move to Josephine, and then she will be giving some more words on the conclusion of the book as we did it together, and we saw this evolved and this conclusions actually coming out on our eyes while editing the book.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lucila. Thank you also, Elisa and Lynn. So as already mentioned by Lucila, and looking at the contents of the book, one of the things that we really wanted to address through this volume was to bring together, sectors that are typically considered distinct or separate, but we really feel all come together in this, ideally circular energy system. Because one of the things that one of our hypotheses going into these projects was that we had a feeling that the fact that a lot of these sectors are still considered often in terms of policy and regulation and legislation as distinct could lead to both incoherence and ineffectiveness in this move from a linear to a circular energy system. This is something that we sort of tried to then, once we had all the contributions by the experts of these particular sectors and aspects of the system, we tried to then bring together in the conclusion by really looking at the extent to which incoherence and ineffectiveness did come out in the current approaches adopted at the EU level. So maybe to briefly expand on how we see incoherence and ineffectiveness. So incoherence is really about the potential interplay of different policies in terms of fit, but even to the extent where you might see two policies that apply even to the same sector, for example, to forestry, but coming out of different DGs or different sort of legislative programs, and how those might at times really impose conflicting obligations on people involved in those activities. And then ineffectiveness is really more also what we see happening then at the implementation level, where member states are really struggling to implement all these at times conflicting messages, leading at times to a less than optimal effectiveness of the policies as they were initially foreseen when adopted at the EU level. So this is something which we saw at several points. I won't go into too much detail right now because that would involve also sort of a knowledge of the different chapters that we couldn't discuss today. But I think that was a really rewarding thing to do in the conclusion, to really be able to sort of draw some of these things together and highlight where we think there are bottlenecks in the current system, which might obstruct this move from linear to circular, which is so urgent and so necessary. And I think one of the outcomes, therefore, which will not surprise many of the people listening today, is that this siloed approach that we've seen in many of these areas really just isn't working if we're going to go towards this much more sort of holistic and integrated model, which is what we're trying to get to the circular energy system. Maybe also to briefly mention, Lucila, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, and just to thank again, first of all, our authors, but also just to have a brief word of thanks to people who have already looked at the volume and who have taken the effort of actually already giving some initial reviews. So we have some really great scholars here, but also people with experience in the field. such as Pettinen, who've really, I'm happy to say, found in the book what we were hoping to offer, which is a volume that really spans this sort of typical divide between practice and policy and law, and also the sort of more technical, like sort of technical, I think is the best term, to technical aspects of the circular energy system, which I think maybe some lawyers, although not the ones here today, tend to shy away from a little bit. So I'm really hoping that this volume will be an introduction also for those who have not yet grappled with those aspects of the system, which are so fundamental, of course, to its functioning. We've lost them now, but I think that was a really positive note to end on. So I'm very happy. We don't need to linger on the acclaim too much. Hopefully, people will simply read the book and be happy with it as they do. But yeah, thank you again, Lucila, for organizing. I know you're both the host and the speaker today, so thank you. And I very much look forward to the Q&A and for discussing the book further.
Thank you so much, Josephine. And I'm so sorry to close the slide or to stop sharing. By mistake, I clicked it. And by mistake, I closed it. It was not actually to interrupt you early. But thanks for making the conclusion of the book, summarize actually your finds, and say thanks for those who endorsed the book and generously endorsed the book, or colleagues. So let me pass on. Now we have like a half an hour of the presentation. Now I think we can dedicate it, let's say, between 20 minutes to questions and answers, because we have here two discussants who accepted from our FSR team, and those are Sophia Nicolai and Ginevra Lemoli. Thanks so much for reading the papers, the chapters. So I will leave you to freely to address your questions. I think, Ginevra, maybe do you want to start it? And then I move the word. You were muted.
Yes, with pleasure.
Yes, and Sophia, and we kind of we see, depending of how demanding is the question, if you answer before Sophia or if you collected all questions and have like a full discussion. Let's see. The floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you. So first, let me congratulate you on this book, both the editors and the other authors, of course, for this very timely volume, and also for inviting me as a discussant. As what I see the role of a discussant as the one of a reader, and also a reader who somehow appreciate the contributions, but also provide some observations regarding issues that arose from the reading. So I will briefly comment on what I believe to be the contribution of the book, and also raise some issue that pop up in my mind that I was going through the different chapters. So I'm the type of reader that comes from international law, as I'm an international lawyer by as an expertise. So in international law, something that is very interesting and that is noteworthy is that there is no specific legal framework regarding either biogas or biofuels. So in fact, a lot of international law of energy is not energy specific, in the meaning that it is about international trade law, international investment law, human rights law, but most of it is sector neutral. Same with climate law. You have the UNFCCC, then you have the Paris Agreement, and is sector neutral. So that means that policy choices are left to national or supranational jurisdiction like the EU. And yet the domestic EU policies are very influential in many ways, can be seen as an extension of the international law, which is relevant for the energy transition. So in this case, the book addresses, in my view, a policy choice, which is important for the transition from two main aspects. One is because it focuses on bioenergy as a form of renewable energy, and also looks at a form of bioenergy based on waste. And lastly, also, there is also a third box that it ticks, in my view. It supports the development of what may become a tactically important industry in the economy of tomorrow, the production of bioenergy from waste. So this point raises the issue of legality under both EU law and international law of green industrial policies. In fact, the book starts with the 2019 EU Green Deal, and it ends with the cross-cutting issues related to taxation and, of course, state aid. So here's my first question, and it can be addressed probably most likely to the editors, because also the author of that specific chapter is not present. So there is this unresolved tension between conductive and aggressive green industrial policy in Europe and respecting the state aid rules. And I would be interested as a non-EU law specialist in knowing how this tension is being navigated in the strategy to develop bioenergy from waste in the EU. I can add another question or simply wait afterwards.
Perhaps you can add it your question, especially if it's addressed to the chapters. And then when the second questions, you make a round of comments, because I think this one definitely Josephine and I would have something to say. And perhaps the other one, Elisa and Lee could address. Okay.
Okay, so I will simply add my last question, which is really comes from my background in international law, and how does this broader green industrial policy on which the EU energy transition is based fit with the EU international legal obligations? So now we've seen the Zeben, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, enter into force, causing a heated debate and reactions from many trading partners. Then another example is the deforestation regulation. And in these and other cases, what is at stake is really the consistency of the EU green transformation strategy with international law. And so how is this taken into account in EU policymaking?
Okay, thank you so much. I would to say as a host, I will leave the floor to the colleagues, to Elisa, to Lynn, if you would like to address any of the answers related, like answer through what you have discussed in the chapters. Do you want to address any of, do you have some would like to answer, to start answering the question?
I can say something on the second question, giving as a premise that I'm not an international lawyer, so I'm more of a European law jurist, and also I also address some national law. Well, it does play into a lot of international commitments that we have between the circular economy and energy production, bioenergy production, and use of waste for the production of energy. Does play into international law commitments. I would maybe, for example, think about, broadly speaking, climate commitments, Paris Agreement, for example. If you consider biomass pools, I'm specifically concerning, specifically addressing forestry materials, because that's the topic of my chapter. Of course, it plays into the fact that if we valorize waste, then we might not be using raw materials as much. That also plays into the fact that we have biodiversity as well, biodiversity commitments. That's exactly the same logic. If you don't valorize waste, then you have to resort to raw materials, and raw materials come with constraints from a biodiversity standpoint. And then, of course, you mentioned deforestation. That is also another constraint, and that also has an interplays with human rights law, because, of course, then you talk about indigenous communities and stuff like that. So I limit myself to that, because I don't want to go into details that don't really pertain to my expertise. But this is what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks enough. Lynn or Josephine, I would like to address one of the points that Shinaka has raised. Lynn?
Yeah, maybe just I mean, I have to admit, I'm not an expert on state aid, which is exactly why, of course, we asked one of our colleagues to contribute that chapter. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that question. Although I do think it's worth mentioning that of course, in state aid, as in many areas where the EU has considerable competence, I think, what is possible under state aid rules is, of course, also a question of what the EU would like to be possible under state aid rules. So I think there, obviously there's some discretion. And I think, also when we look at the taxonomy, for example, that's being adopted, I think, there are clearly steps being taken to make more possible than we would have maybe said 5 years ago, when the approach to state aid and the greening of certain sectors was different, right? So I think that is something where we see many changes taking place. As to your second point, I think it's a really fascinating one, because I think it's something that obviously touches on a lot of the Green Deal and a lot of the projects that are being rolled out under the Green Deal. And I think I see it as a bit of a challenge for the European Union, because on the one hand, there's this very clear positioning of the EU as wanting to be a green leader, wanting to be a rule of law community, wanting to lead by example and through fulfilling all its international obligations. But at the same time, some of its plans in this arena are also now, I think, beyond what is accepted in some areas of international law. So you do see an amount of unilateral action being taken by the EU, which at times is in tension with international, not even only international obligations, but also just international structures that are, have been developed to deal with some of these issues. And I think that's true for the border adjustment mechanism, but also I think there are many other examples. And I think one of the examples that I was also particularly thinking about is the way that the EU has been dealing increasingly with sustainability issues in its bilateral trade agreements, and the increasing use of clauses in those bilateral agreements that incorporate all kinds of obligations being placed on the partner in that field, in line with EU objectives and goals. And I think there's different perspectives we could take on this, right? I think there's a very formal legal one where we can say, well, is the EU empowered to do this? I mean, I guess in certain ways it is, right? I mean, so some places it is. That question has also been asked, to the Court of Justice itself. I mean, they clearly think that it is. That's it's maybe a bit of a biased perspective there, but that question has been asked. I don't know whether the answer is entirely satisfactory, but we have some perspectives on that. I think what's been really interesting is again, in that example of bilateral trade agreements, to see how WTO dispute settlement body has been grappling with that, right, and how they've been looking at this. And I think, for me particularly, what's interesting is the discussion, not even so much on the substance, but also on, is this something that should be under the dispute settlement body, or is it something that maybe doesn't yet belong there? And I think the fact that it's more and more being recognized as something that the dispute settlement body should be looking at, I think is very promising, because as long as these topics are not within these official fora for discussion, then we also can't really have a legal answer to it, right? We can have a realpolitik answer to it, we can have a political answer to it, but we can't have sort of a legal substance to those kind of issues. So I think that's really promising that that's increasingly developing. So I think, going back to your question as to whether this fits with the EU's obligations and whether we can speak of consistency, I think in a certain way we can, because I think the EU sort of definitely sees it all as a part of a package where they're a green leader and an exemplary multilateral sort of negotiator, etc. But I think, of course, there are many critical questions that can and should be asked as to whether that consistency is only visible from the perspective of the EU, or is also there when you look at it more critically from other perspectives, right, from other jurisdictions, from third countries. And I think that is a more loaded question to which I have a less clear answer. And I think, especially on the topics of this book, where so many different policy areas come together, not all of which have historically had this sort of green outlook. I think that's even more. I think there's even more tension there, right? Because it's almost sort of this creeping greening of areas of national and international law, which maybe weren't devised in that way previously. So I think that's going to bring a lot of really interesting questions in the future. So that was a bit longer than I anticipated, but it's a very fascinating question. So thank you for asking it.
Thank you, Josephine. I think I would have something to say about, especially when you spoke about state aid and the autonomy. Article 194, paragraph 2 of the Treaty of Function, I think plays an important role in your answer. But we are a bit advancing in terms of the time, and I want to take the chance or reduce the chance of Sophia give her contribution in the discussion, especially because Sophia at the Florida School of Regulation, she took over and was a great contributor in this chapter of circular economy in our training course of the Green Deal. And she not only this, but she wrote her thesis as well on the subject. So I'm confident she can, she has a lot to say. So Sophia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lucila. So actually, what I would like to say first is really this book is really timely because as we know, next year we will have a new commission, new election. So I think it is great that now you produce this mapping of the issues and opportunities of biogas and biofuel law and policy. So I have a couple of questions, actually. The first one to Elisa about chapter 5, because I think that this chapter really highlighted some crucial points. For example, the fact that the implementation of and the coherence across different legal texts and policies are crucial to their success. Like on the one hand, the Waste Framework Directive, on the other one, the Renewable Energy Directive. So policy progress really must be made in parallel, like considering more and more waste as a resource on the one hand, on the other, for example, this possibility to have a partial extension of the sustainability criteria for agricultural biomass, also to forestry biomass as foreseen in RED 3. So you mentioned in the chapter several times some targets and strategies that actually refer to 2030. So, for example, the new EU forest strategy, the biodiversity strategy, the EU soil strategy for 2030. So I think that these are the closest targets in terms of timing, but I think it is really important also to consider further targets, especially those intermediate targets for 2040, for example. So I would like to understand if what will change in the targets for 2040 compared to 2030 targets for what concerns maybe biofuel and biogas policies. And the second question that I have is to Lynn on chapter 3. I think that your chapter is very interesting because it also points out on a number of interesting issues. So, for example, the fact that the role and the potential of EU circular energy and agricultural law and policy in promoting this in this shift have received actually so far little attention in the literature. The topic of biofuel and biogas from agricultural waste is also very timely because during the energy crisis, the issue of affordability of energy resources revamped, as did the issue of affordability of food resources due to the inflation in the EU area. So I think this is really interesting. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the fact that the waste hierarchy is not applicable to agricultural waste usage for biofuel production. Do you think that actually this can lead to choose alternative usages, alternative activities and processes for agricultural waste that maybe are not optimal from the point of view of the cascading use principle that also Elisa was referring to? In general, I am wondering about the possible negative consequences of not having like the waste hierarchy applicable to this kind of resources.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I think perhaps as far as Lynn did not speak in the last round, we will give her first the word, so Lynn could address your question, and I will move. We will move it to the chapter of Elisa. So Lynn.
Of course, yeah. Thank you very much, Sophia. Just to clarify as well, because I don't think I mentioned that in the presentation, the Waste Framework Directive was not included in our chapter because it clearly exempts agricultural residue or like any sort of waste streams from agriculture or animal or livestock. So we did not include it in the chapter, but it is really interesting to see that it is so clearly exempted in the directive itself. And in terms of the waste hierarchy, that it is not applicable. And so the alternative usages of that agricultural waste, right now, there are already quite a few usages of agricultural residue and waste that is out with sort of energy production, right? So you can, there's a lot of compost making, for instance, like I said, tillage into the soil, returning that soil fertility and increasing the carbon sequestration capacity of the soil as well. And so a lot of this agricultural waste on farms is not lost necessarily. It is just at a different alternative use. And not having that waste hierarchy applicable to agricultural waste, I'm not sure if it does provide a lot more room for valorization of these agricultural waste management systems. But when you talk, for instance, about livestock or animal manure production specifically, the amount that is created, the methane emissions, the other greenhouse gas emissions coming from this, it is incredibly important that we do have a more coherent structure and a more regulatory support when it comes to these waste management systems, because there is still such a potential to be valorized, but it's completely, from what we've seen in the Common Agricultural Policy and the Renewable Energy Directive, quite underutilized in that way, because there's no specific economic or investment support towards it, and the responsibility is very much on the member states, especially with the Common Agricultural Policy, right? What is also really interesting about the criteria when it comes to using food and feed crops for the feedstock of biofuels in the Renewable Energy Directive, like I said, you need to have a certified low indirect land use change risk to be able to use it as a feedstock. But actually a lot of the biofuels that are already being used, for instance, on rapeseed oil and sugarcane, are automatically certified as being low risk because their indirect land use change has already happened. And so for the future, it's not pushing towards moving away from those food and feed crops for feedstock, but moving as much as I would like to see, because that really forces people to then use alternatives such as those other waste streams.
Thanks a lot. I think you answered and remember a lot when we had like that conference throughout on the middle production of the book, in which we come out with the first drafts, and it was exactly when Josephine and I got the very surprised at what we expected actually to see from the part one of the book, in which was like a coherent systems of changes of regulations, in which would lead to the use of the waste in agriculture to channel, exactly as I said at the beginning, to the production of energy you couldn't see there. It's kind of, the voices reverberating in the energy silos was not reaching the agriculture, and you couldn't see these incoherences. We started to see the first sparklings of this.
And you can see that a lot in the Common Agricultural Policy itself as well, because it's not making any distinction when it comes to crop-based biofuel or agricultural waste biofuel. It all contributes to the renewable production of biogas, but there's no distinction between the two feedstocks. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing. It's like there's no, that narrative has not trickled down into that Common Agricultural Policy.
Okay. Thank you so much, Lynn. I think it's precisely the message, I think the key message that we envision in the conclusion. And then I will pass to Elisa, and Elisa, perhaps to give answer as well, because you used to give questions and answers, and use it, give the audience the opportunity to answer, to ask questions for the audience. We have at the moment one question from Regina, and actually I think it's addressed to you, because she asked it actually in the first presentation, a double counting was mentioned, and she would like to understand a bit better. So perhaps if you could address the question of Elisa together with the question of Regina, because we have plus 5 minutes, and then we conclude at the end, which was, I'm super happy actually. So it's yours, Elisa.
Okay, so I have to answer Sophia's and the Q&A question, right? At the same time. Yeah. Yes. So starting with Sophia's question, well, I don't have the text under me right now, so I don't necessarily know that there's a 2040 target expressed in the agreement the final agreement that was reached this summer, and I don't think it's also and it's not in the current RED, the current version of the RED. So I don't think there's an intermediate target for 2030, and then there's the final 2050. As far as I can remember now, on top of my head, it's a bit difficult to say. I do believe that, especially in terms of climate targets, 2040 maybe could have been inserted. But at the same time, I think we need to move fast, and the initial period, I think it's the most important one. And so I think the EU is focusing on the 2030 now because we need the faster deployment of renewables. And I think that's the reason I might be mistaken, but this is my take on this. And then for the chat's question, it was about the biofuel, advanced biofuels and yeah, so the directive sets different targets, and one of the targets is the targets for transportation. And in the current, in the RED 2, now I don't remember, in the RED 3, the targets have been increased, but in the RED 2 we have a 14% target. And for advanced biofuels, we have a secondary target of 3.5% to be reached in 2030. So advanced biofuels basically are biofuels that are basically produced from feedstock listed in a specific part of the RED 2, and that is Annex 9. And basically, they can be considered twice their energy content. So they're counted double their energy content towards the targets that I just mentioned. That's basically the gist of it. And this is because the Commission and the EU in general wanted to increase the attractiveness of these feedstock materials for the production of these biofuels, and the uses as well, and the use of these biofuels. And the list is quite, I think, comprehensive. There's quite a few feedstocks listed there. And it can be, basically, it's based on an analysis taking into consideration certain aspects. We do have, for example, circular economy, waste hierarchy, sustainability criteria, market distortions and stuff like that. We do not at the moment, well, in the RED 2, express consideration of the cascading principle. So for me, that's one of the issues we have also there. And I think, I think that suffices, unless there's a more specific question, but I think more than this, I don't know. And more, of course, can be read in the chapter, but I think
it was excellent, Elisa. I think, yeah, I think what we have in mind is that, of course, we're trying here, the exercise we're trying here is to summarize, or at least to give you a piece of what we have been working the last 2 years, and in 1 hour you could not bring it all the authors, because of course we want to bring it everybody.
Well, I just remember one other thing.
Go ahead.
Very quickly, this target, this double counting target, was sort of slashed in the proposal for the RED 3, because the Commission adopted a sort of chose for an efficiency. I remember the name. The GHG intensity reduction target, basically focusing on the efficiency and the performance of the fuels rather than on the feedstock. But I think in the agreement, the final agreement reached this summer, there's both of them. So the member states and the Parliament decided, I don't remember in which version that was, but decided in the final text to maintain both things. So I don't necessarily know why, but there you go. That's a piece of information to share, and I'm done.
Thanks a lot, Elisa. I think thanks for complimenting the answer. I think we are 1 minute close to the end, so we didn't have much chance to question and answers to actually collect more questions. But I think the most important is that, of course, here is a sample of the book. We have all the book that you can it's soon out in December, and digested it and read it was as much of us. It was our conclusions comes as didn't was my core initial hypothesis. Come as a confirmation throughout the chapters. We're very happy with the conclusion. Wanted to thank you very much all the contributors. I cannot mention all of them, Benita, Edwin, Maduro, those that we have here, Maciek, Piero, Maria Oxac from FSA, Ilaria Conte from FSA. We have some contributors also from FSA. And of course, thank you so much for being here, presenting your chapters, discussing and disseminating the book, because this is what FSI Insights is about. It's about giving space to disseminated academic works, scholarship, and to our general audience. So thank you so much for the speakers. Thank you so much for the discussants. Thank you so much for Dani for supporting us in the background, and hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.